For nearly 80 years, the most famous image of Megalodon on Earth wasn't a fossil. It was a museum reconstruction, a single towering jaw built from teeth that never actually belonged to the same animal. And for most of scientific history, nobody had the evidence needed to prove that jaw was wrong. Scientists eventually compared it against real, physically associated fossil evidence, teeth found still locked together exactly as they sat in one shark's mouth the day it died, and found the famous reconstruction didn't match reality at all. The actual proof took decades to surface, and until it did, an entire century of public imagination was shaped by a mistake nobody could yet demonstrate was one. That reconstruction was built in 1909 by Bashford Dean, an ichthyologist at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, who held an unusual second career at the very same time, serving as an expert in medieval and modern armor at the Metropolitan Museum of Art across town. A background that may well have shaped how comfortable he was assembling something as physically imposing as a giant predator's jaw for public display. The shark itself is the reason building an accurate version was ever going to be this difficult in the first place. Megalodon's skeleton, like every shark's, was made almost entirely of cartilage rather than bone, and cartilage essentially never survives the fossilization process the way solid mineral-rich bone does, breaking down and dissolving away long before it has any chance to mineralize into rock. What Megalodon left behind instead is teeth, enormous numbers of them, since a shark sheds and replaces its teeth continuously throughout its entire life, sometimes losing tens of thousands of individual teeth across a single lifetime. As older ones fall out and new ones rotate forward to replace them, along with the occasional calcified vertebra that manage to survive where the rest of the skeleton could not, since vertebrae in sharks contain enough mineral content to sometimes fossilize even when everything else around them breaks down completely. A complete megalodon skeleton has never been found, and given how cartilage behaves in the fossil record over millions of years, one almost certainly never will be. That meant anyone attempting to reconstruct what the animal's jaw actually looked like had no intact specimen to measure against, only loose teeth scattered across different fossil sites around the world and pulled from different individual sharks entirely, with no way yet to confirm how many belonged together or where each one actually sat inside a single living animal's mouth at the time it was alive. Dean built his reconstruction anyway, working with the best fossil material available to him at the time, since waiting for better evidence simply wasn't an option for a museum eager to display something this dramatic. Lacking any confirmed set of teeth from one individual shark, he assembled the jaw using the largest teeth he could locate from collections and fossil sites scattered across different locations entirely, and made a critical assumption that would define public perception of Megalodon for the rest of the century: that most of the teeth lining a real megalodon's jaw were roughly the same size as those largest specimens he had selected. In a living shark's mouth, tooth size actually varies considerably by position, with the biggest teeth concentrated toward the front of the jaw and progressively smaller ones filling out the sides and back, a pattern seen consistently across nearly every shark species alive today. Dean's model didn't account for that variation at all. The result was a jaw over 10 feet wide, lined with teeth that researchers would later estimate could have numbered up to 276 in total across a real living animal. And based on the reconstruction's overall dimensions, Dean estimated Megalodon could have reached lengths exceeding 80 feet, with some later extrapolations built on his model pushing that figure as high as 98 feet. If you find this interesting, be sure to subscribe to understand more DNA from the past. The reconstruction became an instant sensation the moment it went on display to the public. A photograph of Dean and several museum officials posing inside the open jaw circulated widely across newspapers and popular science publications of the era, and the image proved durable enough to remain part of the public conversation around giant sharks for decades afterward, resurfacing repeatedly in books, articles, and casual conversation as shark fascination surged through popular culture in the years surrounding films like Jaws in the 1970s. decades after Dean himself had already died. Dean's jaw wasn't even the first attempt at a Megalodon reconstruction, though it became by far the most influential one ever built, and the only version most people would ever come to associate with the species. A far less famous version had already been mounted at Chicago's Field Museum around 1894, roughly 15 years before Dean's own reconstruction, described in the museum's own guidebook at the time as belonging to an ancient shark, probably 50 to 70 feet long, an estimate that, notably, set far closer to the modern corrected figure than Dean's later, far more famous version ever did. Almost nothing else about that earlier model survived in the historical record beyond a few scattered mentions in old annual reports, including notes that it required repair after damage from museum guests, and it never captured public attention the way Dean's version at the American Museum of Natural History eventually did. For most of the 20th century, Dean's oversized jaw was effectively the only Megalodon reconstruction most people, including plenty of working scientists outside the specific field of shark paleontology, had ever actually seen in person or in print. The problem was that nobody could prove the assumption behind it wrong, because doing so required something nobody had: a genuine, physically intact set of Megalodon teeth, recovered exactly as they sat inside one individual animal's jaw, undisturbed since the moment it died, with nothing added, removed, or swapped in from a completely different shark entirely. Without that kind of direct evidence, correcting Dean's model meant replacing one educated guess with another, and for decades, no fossil discovery gave researchers anything better to work with. The oversized jaw simply persisted, treated as the closest thing to settled science that a shark with no surviving skeleton could ever realistically produce, appearing in museum displays, documentaries, textbooks, and popular science writing largely unchallenged for generation after generation of readers who had no reason to doubt what they were looking at. Even paleontologists working outside the narrow specialty of extinct shark research often had little reason to question a reconstruction endorsed by one of the most respected natural history museums in the world, since Dean's professional standing and the sheer physical presence of the display itself lent it a credibility that outpaced the actual evidence supporting it, a gap between reputation and proof that would take another 80 years to fully close. That finally changed in 1989, when a Japanese research team led by paleontologists T. Uyeno, O. Sakamoto, and H. Sekin excavated partial Megalodon remains from Saitama, Japan, and recovered something nobody studying the species had ever had direct access to before: a nearly complete, genuinely associated set of teeth, still arranged close to their original positions from a single shark that had died with its full dentition intact. For the first time in the history of Megalodon research, scientists could count exactly how many teeth actually filled each row of a real Megalodon's jaw, and see directly how dramatically tooth size shrank, moving from the front of the mouth toward the back, the exact detail Dean's assumption had ignored entirely 80 years earlier when he had no comparable evidence available to check his work against. A second major find followed at the Lee Creek mine in the Yorktown Formation of North Carolina, producing another nearly complete associated dentition that gave researchers a crucial second data point, confirming the pattern documented in Japan wasn't a one-off anomaly specific to a single unusual specimen. Together, these two discoveries, recovered on opposite sides of the planet from one another, did something the scientific community had been missing for the better part of a century. They proved, with direct physical evidence rather than an educated guess, exactly what a real Megalodon jaw actually looked like in life. Subscribe to not miss the next one. Armed with that evidence, researchers went back and reassessed Dean's original model directly, comparing its proportions against the newly confirmed tooth arrangement for the first time in the reconstruction's 80-year history. The verdict was clear and, by then, long overdue. His reconstruction had overestimated the jaw's true dimensions by roughly a third, inflated entirely by the assumption that uniformly large teeth filled the entire mouth rather than tapering steadily toward the back, the way real Megalodon dentitions actually did in life. Applying the corrected proportions brought Megalodon's estimated length down from Dean's extrapolated 80 to 98 feet, to a range far closer to 50 to 55 feet, a figure that has held up considerably better against the growing body of Megalodon fossil evidence recovered in the years since these two associated tooth sets were finally described. Researchers calculated that an accurately scaled version of Dean's own model, corrected for the real tooth proportions revealed by the Saitama and Lee Creek discoveries, would need to be roughly 70% the size of the original 1909 reconstruction to actually match what real fossil evidence now showed. The correction reached the public stage directly in 1992, when the Smithsonian Institution commissioned paleontologist John Macy to construct an entirely new set of Megalodon jaw replicas, built using the far more reliable dentition data that had emerged from Lee Creek, rather than repeating Dean's original assumptions about uniform tooth size. For the first time in more than 80 years, museum visitors could stand in front of a Megalodon jaw reconstruction built on genuine associated fossil evidence instead of an educated guess made without any way to check it. The correction mattered for more than just accuracy on a museum floor. An accurate jaw shape and tooth arrangement gave researchers a genuine foundation for calculating bite force and feeding capability, figures that depend directly on the true proportions of the mouth doing the biting, meaning every estimate of what Megalodon could or couldn't have hunted, built on Dean's inflated model, had been resting on flawed geometry for the better part of a century before anyone had the corrected data needed to redo the math properly. The correction didn't stop at jaw width either, and research into the animal's true proportions has continued well beyond fixing the mouth alone. In the years since, further study of Megalodon's vertebral proportions has continued refining the picture even further, suggesting the animal's overall body shape was considerably leaner and less bulky than earlier reconstructions, including Dean's had ever assumed, adding yet another layer to a century-long process of slowly replacing assumption with actual physical evidence, one fossil discovery at a time, each correction building directly on the last. Line up the full history of that reconstruction, and the picture becomes less about a single mistake and more about how long an unproven assumption can shape public understanding once nobody has the evidence needed to challenge it directly, regardless of how much good faith went into building it in the first place. Bashford Dean wasn't reckless or careless when he built his jaw in 1909, working at the very edge of what fossil science could actually support at the time with the tools and specimens available to him. He was working with the only fossil material available to him, and he made the most reasonable assumption he could without any associated tooth set anywhere in the world to check it against, a limitation no amount of caution or expertise on his part could have overcome given the evidence that simply didn't exist yet anywhere on the planet. That assumption still ended up defining Megalodon's public image for the better part of a century, reproduced in photographs, museum halls, documentaries, and popular imagination long after better evidence should have replaced it, simply because the fossils needed to prove it wrong hadn't been found yet by anyone, anywhere in the world. It took a discovery on the other side of the world in Japan, confirmed by a second independent discovery in North Carolina, nearly a century after Dean first assembled his jaw, to finally hand scientists the one thing he never had access to: direct, physical proof of what a real Megalodon's jaw actually looked like. Teeth still sitting exactly where the shark itself had left them the day it died, waiting patiently in the ground for nearly a century for someone to finally dig them up together and put the record straight.